Hey everybody, this is Casey Smith, and this is episode 3 of NST Things. I'm coming to you on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2019. Holidays have been a bit crazy this year, a lot going on, but actually able to take a little breather today just to enjoy the time with the baby and just do some stuff with the family and just hang around and relax, not have to worry about wrapping anything or attending anything. So today's feeling pretty good. So I had a couple different topics that I was going to talk about today, some unique things that I've come across in the office and some things that are still kind of in the works, and some other stuff that was going to take a little more time and go into a bit more detail. So we're going to hold off on a couple of them. But one of the ones that I'd like to mention, which is a bit easier, and something that is somewhat resolved. We're just kind of waiting for the patient to push themselves a little bit harder. We had a father and son come in, and the son was a desk worker, did a lot of CAD design, stuff like that, and was a gamer too. So pretty much he sat at a desk the majority of his day, and he would slouch into that position. Very common. He was also very tall, which you can find this in many taller people, especially women. They don't tend to, well, not all, but some don't tend to own the space that they were given. So a lot of them you'll find they slouch. Women can do this if they grow taller than everybody else, say in like middle school, high school. They will slouch to shrink themselves down to kind of get down in the social atmosphere where their friends are. Just interesting kind of things that we'll see happen. The same will happen for, young ladies that maybe develop a little bit earlier, are busty at an early age. They'll slouch to kind of conceal that and not make their breasts seem so large. This kid was stuck in a similar pattern. I want to say he's about 6'5", and his father had come in, I want to say a couple days later, and the story of this, where I'm kind of going with this, is that the father and son, although they were very similar in a lot of the issues that they had, both of them measured for leg length inequities. And interestingly enough, the son was just experiencing low back pain. The dad was actually experiencing hip pain, and the dad was a bit more active. He was a runner, average about 6-8 miles a run. And as I worked with them both, the father, what I found interesting was he had measured that I believe his left side was lower. And when he first came in, pull up his note real quick. So actually he not only measured with the pelvic tilt, but he measured with pelvic flexion on the right side. So his right hip was flexing more, which, sometimes we'll see with leg length inequities and things like that. So I went through and I said, and I kind of do this with all first patients within their first, I'd say, depending on how it goes with them, first, second, and third appointment. We don't have the ability to shoot x-rays like some areas do, so we kind of make do with what we have. And in doing so, we have to eliminate certain things or make sure things are correcting properly. And one thing that we started working on with this gentleman was working his lateral hip, working in his glute minimus, some of the other flexors and stuff on the right side. And then he also had some cranial imbalances, but he was a case where when he lied down, his cranium corrected. So for those of you that don't know or understand what I'm speaking of, the cranial correction, or to perform cranial corrections, we make corrections off of the lying down measurements. That's when the gravitational push on the body and the rest of the structural imbalances are no longer feeding into the system. The cranium is able to be at rest on the table when it's not supporting all that. And he measured great. Honestly, like no distortions, which is uncommon, especially with seeing what his son's patterns and things like that were. And where there's like a lot of head forward posture, and in turn had developed some rotations and things like that. And his father didn't have this at all, but what was stuck was his hip his hip was locked in such a position it was forcing his cranium to try to correct, and his cranium actually wasn't doing what we would want it to do. And this kind of goes back to some level of the reactor stuff, and I believe I've talked about a little bit in previous episodes. But basically, we can't have the cranium and the pelvis locked in the same position. Functionally, the body does not like that. It does not perform well that way. It adds more pressure on the nervous system, makes it hard for the body to move around in general. So, first appointment, treated his lateral hip. Second appointment, interestingly enough, it switched. And when I saw these things, I hesitated on trying to put anything in his shoe because I didn't want to rush the process. I've had it happen before where I put a lift in prematurely and someone overcorrected. And it was just because if I would have done more soft tissue work in the beginning, we could have avoided the lift, period. So when he had come back in, I wanted to see, were we seeing improvements? And we had seen some, but basically what had happened is everything switched. His cranium was doing so much better. Some of his shoulder issues and stuff had improved. But his pelvis had switched entirely. So instead of having this like flexion disorder and one hip doing one thing and one hip doing another, it got rid of that, but it created a tilt, to the opposing side. So doing my diligence, when I see an overcorrection, that usually tells me that there was an imbalance long ago that your body has then compensated over the top of. So you may see a measurement one way, and you're trying to treat an issue, say, on the left side. And they also have an older issue on the right side. Sometimes time is a factor. Sometimes it's trauma level. There's a lot that kind of goes into that. But say a good example would be, say you see an elevated left shoulder. So we go to treat the elevators, or treating trap, or treating tricep, all this stuff. If they have an oblique issue, say on the opposite side, on the right side, that oblique could be overpowering what's occurring on the left. So you could be treating something on the left thinking you're going down the right path, when in turn, if you were to correct the older, more traumatized area, the area that has more neurological feedback and is reacting more, if you can break that down, a lot of times you'll see the pattern switch. And this is what his case was doing. So after the right side had improved with how it was functioning and the health of the tissue, boom, the left side, something was going on there before, pulled the pelvis back into the opposite distortion. So we spent that appointment treating that and working on his shoulder a bit more. Great news, though, is that his levit reactor actually started coming back into synchronization. So his cranium was actually starting to balance itself when it was standing, which let me know that we broke up the initial pattern, which was flexed right hip and flexed right cranium. So when I just recently saw him, he's one of the individuals that you can tell is just very hesitant on getting back into a routine of running and things like that. Part of the right hip issue in the beginning was due to running. So he's a bit fearful in that, but when he came back in, I was really astonished at the fact that, his cranium had maintained stability, his pelvis had actually leveled out, his shoulders had vastly improved as well, and everything was just coming together. This is a perfect example of, you feel you have all these things going on, and you do, you got some stuff going on. But we're under the impression that some sort of surgery or some sort of physical therapy for eternity has to take place. And that's not the case. This is session 3 for this gentleman. We spend roughly, 3 hours, and not all of that is hands-on time either. That's assessing and everything in between. Within 3 sessions, we've cleared a functional leg length inequity. We've corrected the shoulder imbalances. We've got his cranium working perfectly. We've got this guy in a perfect place where now he can go back out. He can start to exercise, run a little heavier, get back into some of those routines, and then we'll see what flares up, if anything does. Now, in his son's case, what's interesting is his son, because of the slouch pattern, because of the head forward posture and all this stuff, he had strained a lot of tissue in his neck. He had brought some tissue in his upper back, eccentric, and his low back. And I measured him after roughly about 3 sessions. And interestingly enough, his measurements kept getting worse. So one was, although they were related, father and son, We sometimes will see that if mom or dad has a leg length, it can transfer down into one of the kids or multiple kids, or if one has maybe a predisposition to flat feet, you name it. And he was this example where dad had functional imbalances. We were able to correct them. Everything started falling into place. Awesome. Whereas the son, as we made more corrections, we were peeling back the compensations his body had created over the years. So we were making him feel better, but at the same time, his body couldn't sustain this because it was wanting to revert back to those old patterns the minute he would more or less kind of leave the office. So this was, for me, a bit of an eye-opening experience. I mean, I've seen patients come in where maybe they don't have a leg length and their kid does or something like that. But to see two people come in the same week, to see what dad's dealing with, to see what the son's dealing with, to not make assumptions, to not rush ahead and want to put a lift in, prematurely when we haven't really done our diligence, and then taking the time to notice significant imbalances that, if corrected, not only do we end up taking less time from the patient, less money, everything. We don't put them through unnecessary steps like, putting them in a lift or, adding a couple extra appointments because we need to explain certain things and go through certain things. Just doing your diligence. Now, I will say his son was equally as interesting. And I believe this is kind of a stat that we go off of, is for every, we'll say 50% of individuals with a leg length inequity have what we call hemipelvis. So basically what that means is when you're sitting down, one pelvic bone or one ilium is actually shorter. So the top of your ilium to the bottom of your ischium is shorter on one side. What that does is it creates the same pelvic tilt that you may be experiencing when you're standing upright. And although this young man did sit down quite a bit, like I'd mentioned, being a desk worker and then playing games and things like that on a PC at night, his hips measured great. So when he was sitting, his body was actually trying to correct for the imbalances he was walking around with during the day. So I found that many patients will experience more pain when an area that is used to being contracted finally has a chance to alleviate, or if the pattern tries to shift itself and that contracted tissue isn't wanting to release properly. So in his case, when he would stand upright, he would slouch, he would burden the spine, he would burden all the surrounding tissue, but he's also walking around with what ended up being roughly a 6 millimeter left leg length inequity. And I was able to, as I saw things progressing, as the treatments went on, we put a lift in, started a little lower, went a little higher, ended up landing at 6, did some muscle testing. He responded well to it. And we could see everything start to change now. So what I anticipate happening in the future is, now that he's actually been assigned a lift, we know that he needs it. It's not a functional imbalance like his father. It's actually structural. Then we can now, when he comes back in, say, okay, you've been wearing the lift, your spine is under less burden, your pelvis is under less burden, your posture is improved because of all of this, and getting some of these distortions to go away. How does your back feel now when you sit down? And what we'll find is, when he goes back to a sitting position, now that we've begun correcting the standing distortions, we'll find that the burden of his body, or the shifting that should try to, or that wants to take place when he's sitting down, it's already going to be there. His spine's not going to want to shift. His pelvis is going to be level when he's standing. His pelvis is going to maintain that same levelness when he actually sits down, unless he's sitting crooked. Things like that can be variables. But in general, just structurally looking at the bones, we can find that if you're maintaining the same position all the time, and you have good mobility, good tissue health, the pain patterns eliminate because the dysfunction leaves the area. So I guess the easiest way to kind of think of it is, if you're experiencing pain, you have dysfunction, whether it be locally or maybe down the road a little bit. And there's a lot of different varieties of ways things can manifest. But if you have pain, you have dysfunction in your body. And if you can correct that dysfunction, you may not be able to correct some of the damages that have already taken place, but you can maybe unbind a joint. You can relieve tension on a tendon that could be potentially tearing something, or potentially tearing itself. And if you can alleviate that pressure on the body then has opportunities to heal itself in whichever way that may be. Now, that doesn't mean tendons are just going to reattach and things are going to heal up and herniations can disappear and all that. What we'll find is as you alleviate pressure on the structure will try to readapt. So if there is a herniation, we've seen cases where herniations will start to merge back into the disc because the pressure that caused the herniation created a wedging effect. And if the wedging effect is corrected, thus the herniation goes away, because the herniation is only a symptom or a side effect of the wedging in the disc itself. So some interesting things structurally there along the lines of leg length inequities, and not having to, look at a scan or just rely solely on a scan. This is something that can be assessed, in person through some of the basic measurement skills that we go through, checking and rechecking, understanding the work that you're doing, understanding what's priority, and kind of bringing all that stuff in a proper alignment so you don't waste your time and you don't waste the patient's time. Now, let's see. Which other one do I want to go into? This one is, we'll talk about this one because it's actually very interesting to me. Never had anything like this happen before with a patient. I may have mentioned on the last one a little bit. The last time I touched on this topic, or when I worked on this patient, was back in October. And what she had been dealing with, kind of the short of it, is she was suffering with hot flashes. She had been doing some cleanses, things like that, through another practitioner that I work with, and they were helping. What she was finding was she had a lot of heavy metals in her body, and her body wasn't purging them out. She went through a process of that. It helped. Hot flashes improved. They came back shortly thereafter. We had decided to do some cheek and TMJ work one day. What I had found just by starting to work on her cheeks, and then I actually ended up working into her tongue and her sublinguals and her, basically the floor of her mandible. As I worked into that area more and more, she kept noticing metal tasting. What that told me is that metal had either maybe stored up in the lymphatic system, had maybe stored up in certain glands. We know glands secrete, they don't pump necessarily. So that lack of movement and then all of the soft tissue contracting around it can create a very inhibited state. So things don't maybe function as well as they should, or maybe they're shutting down completely and they're what we would maybe consider low functioning. I want to say I heard kind of through another patient that she had noticed some relief from the hot flashes after doing that and having the metal release. I think she said she tasted it for about 2 days. I'd seen her for a follow-up maybe about 2-3 weeks ago, and we were talking about things, and I'd asked her about the hot flashes again. They'd come back, and they'd come back by that point for about 4 weeks. And that's disappointing. This was something that I didn't expect to change, but at the same time, it's like, whoa, this is a life changer. Like, I want to say 40-50% of the women I see have either experienced hot flashes or they're having them now. And for me to be able to change that or better understand how we could potentially influence that could potentially help me help other people down the road. So I wanted to try to understand what was happening. And as I looked back through her charts, I'd realized that we had only done that treatment once because she noticed such amazing results from it that we kind of switched gears and started working at some other things that she had come in with. And when I had seen her, it was about, I'd say, 6-8 weeks from the first treatment date for the metal work. And when we went through her cheeks the second time, she didn't really notice too much from there. But immediately when we went to the floor of the mandible, started working through some of the hyoid muscles, started working around the tongue, boom, like immediately the metal taste came back. So what that had told me is we may have simulated, I guess what we'll call the purge of maybe certain metals, or they began moving. Like I said, I'm not exactly sure if maybe they're in the lymphatic system or if maybe they're stuck in the soft tissue, maybe the glands, etc. If somebody has knowledge of this, I'd love to hear it. From my understanding, metals can kind of store everywhere in the body. So when I worked on her, I kind of took a more generalized approach. I didn't spend extra time doing like lymphatic massage and things like that. We didn't do any lymphatic stuff to see if she would notice a metal taste in her mouth. So if anybody has any further knowledge, I'd love to hear about it, because like I said, this is a new case to me, but we're doing some things that aren't in, the textbook, so to speak. And it's actually creating a big impact in somebody's life. So as we did this again, I want to say for the remainder of the treatment, she continued to taste metal. It did amplify and get a little more intense at a certain point. But she is still kind of a case study in progress, I guess you could say, on how the benefits are really going to kind of pan out for her. The last time she admitted that, for a day or two, she was still tasting metal. So I have a full anticipation that she will be probably experiencing the same thing this time. My hope for in the future is if she notices less of the metal tasting, that or a reduced amount, that the body is expelling it the way that it should be. So from, I guess, some testing she had done, she does know she's a low methylator, so she does get rid of metal slowly. But she has good bowel movements, and she's staying on top of her diet that she knows she needs to take, because she has certain foods that cause inflammation. And in turn, if she can expel, her body's going to be able to detox and get rid of those metals. So one thing I'm looking forward to seeing in the future is, does she notice less metal? The duration after the treatment, how many days do you taste metal after the fact? And then, of course, the big question is, how many hot flashes have you experienced between this time and this time? When I saw you here and when I saw you here, what metals and stuff did you taste? What time frame was that on? And just kind of documenting all this to see exactly what it takes. We find that a lot of tissues can be treated within, 3-4 sessions to break up a fixed pattern in a muscle group. And it'll be very interesting to see if we find the same thing for this as well. Typically for treating organs, unless somebody's, maybe doing something or taking something that's burdening the body, we can see organ corrections or organ tension go away within a treatment or two. What's interesting about this is, although we are treating not the sublinguals directly, we're treating them a bit indirectly, but we're also treating the soft tissue around it. So where is the metal actually stored? Is it in the soft tissue? Is it in the glands? That's kind of the hard part to figure out. But one thing that, I guess, I don't want to say reinforces why the metal could be there, but everybody has neck tension, especially on the anterior side, so the front of the neck. So basically from your chin to your clavicle is jacked up on everybody in the world. I've met very few people that don't have front cervical tension. That tension ends up leading to some sort of posterior neck pain, will pull you into a head forward posture, which leads to other structural imbalances or can lead to other issues in the rest of your body. It also leads to cranial imbalances and a variety of other things. So it's just going to be interesting to see how this kind of plays out. To see things change structurally all day, and then to have someone come in where we're focusing more on the organs, and getting things to open up that way. It's just interesting. It's unique. But like I said, everybody kind of has this anterior neck tension. So whether you're stretching it, whether or not your therapist is working on it, it's not an area that gets, I guess we'd say, a lot of circulation. Lymphatic massage is usually great for this area. Because the tissues are usually so tight, there's a certain amount of stagnation that occurs. So if you start feeling sick, a lot of times you feel it around your throat first. That's not a coincidence. Your lymphatic system's backed up. Start doing some dry brushing immediately. And I found personally myself that if I actually get on dry brushing, because I won't do it routinely, I'm not going to lie to you. But when I start feeling sick or like something's coming on, that dry brushing it just does work. Okay. It gets all that junk that's getting stored up in your system, which also means your neck is probably tight. So if you're doing lymphatic work, you might as well do some soft tissue work too. Stretch it out, get it to open up. If you can mobilize that tissue and mobilize that lymph, your body's going to be able to take care of it, what it needs to. Your immune system's going to better upregulate and get to actually what it needs to. So it's going to be interesting to see how just the tension in this area, alleviating tension, helping the tissues that could be somewhat inhibited come back to normal functionality. This will be a cool case. I haven't had one like this for a while, and the work is so simple. It's so easy, like basic stuff. I mean, I could literally tell you how to, rub around your tongue or rub the floor of your mouth over the phone. Like, it's not difficult to do. And that's one thing I've realized as I've done this work more. There are certain things that people can do for themselves, and that you have the full capability. If you were told to do certain things the right way, and you actually practiced them, and you developed a certain amount of touch in your hands, which you'd be surprised at what you can feel when you actually try, you'd be able to accomplish quite a bit. So if this is something that continues to benefit the patient, and we see some cool results from, or even if it fails and it sucks, and I gotta admit that, hey, it was a shot. Cast the bread upon the water. If you don't try, you'll never know if it's going to work out. So this will be one that we'll be touching base on in the future. Like I said, I usually see this one about, I think it was 4 weeks from her last oral treatment, but I want to say it was about 2 weeks that I'd seen her. So hopefully I'll see her in the next coming weeks after the holidays, and we'll be able to get an update on this and see what's improved. I'll be able to report back to you. So the last one that I wanted to discuss here is a combination of a patient that currently came in, or that I've currently been treating, and then he came in with some newer problems. Fortunately, he was already at the office when this stuff kind of manifested, and I'll explain more why. But it's also going to combine some things that I've learned from other patients as well with similar issues. So a gentleman that I'd been treating for a shoulder issue came in, and it looked like he was bitten by bugs, spiders, something like that. And he went to the doctor. I said, hey, that kind of looks weird. You got them all the way up your leg and up your back. I could go to the doctor. So he goes to the doctor, finds out it's shingles. So he takes an antiviral, it does all this stuff. Mind you, he's 69. Great shape, works out all the time. Like, he does well for himself as far as, taking care of his body, lifestyle, everything. Like, he's on point. So he goes through the shingles process. And as he's going through the process, I know his body's under a lot of burden, his neurological system's under a lot of burden, and he just seems a little sluggish. And then, not the last time, but the time before that he had come in, and he comes at bi-weekly. He came in and he just looked old. And I mean, I'm not bashing the guy. Age is a gift many of us don't receive. So to be able to get to old age and still be doing the stuff that he's doing, I mean, I applaud the man. But he just came in and it looked like, I don't know, somebody just kind of like snatched some life out of him. I mean, he looked paler. He looked, he just looked aged. He looked like he aged a lot. And I could just tell like what his system was kind of going through. But the thing that stuck out the most is he just seemed a little slow. And he didn't really mention anything like that his coordination was off or anything was kind of bad. So I was like, you know what? And we talked, and he said he was still kind of dealing with some of the shingles repercussions, although he had went through the antiviral cycle and all that sort of stuff. So another 2 weeks go by, and he comes back in, and I noticed the same thing, but I feel like it was a little worse this last time. And as we kind of segue into the treatment, he goes, all right, I went and saw my neurologist. They put me on some Parkinson's medication. We're going to see if this helps. And basically, I guess the test is, hey, we're going to put you on this medication. We're going to start you on a simple dosage. And if it alleviates the symptoms, then, hey, you have Parkinson's. And we'll go from there. Maybe they can refine it a little bit more. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. This gentleman also had suffered a stroke in the past. So when they were checking him out, apparently they did some scans and they said, hey, there's also a possibility that you had a minor stroke again. And he came in, like I said, he looked older, he looked aged, but he didn't seem like he had a stroke. Obvious, typical signs, depending on what side of the brain is affected, the right side or left side of the whole hemisphere gets affected. So in his case, the left side had been affected in the past. His right side had, I'll say, was affected, but he didn't have repercussions. So he didn't use a walker. He still has full use. He can go to the gym, use both legs, both arms. When I had seen him, he'd been taking the Parkinson's medication for 4 days. And he said he noticed little, if any, change. But then when he mentioned the stroke, I had reflected back to 2 other cases I had seen in the past. And 2 other stroke patients I had seen, one was a good friend of mine who, it was a bit of a tragedy when it happened, but he came out of it like a phoenix. He was a very physical guy, had a stroke. It was severe enough that, I'll say it kind of like paralyzed the right side of his body. His right arm was immobilized. His right leg was very stiff. It messed up his speech, and he had a very, very, very difficult time thinking and putting words into, or a thought process into words. And another patient had come to me a little bit later. I had seen him about a week after his stroke. Another patient, a female patient, had a similar distortion pattern, but different symptoms. So physically, she was more impaired, whereas the first gentleman actually physically improved quite well. It was the mental speech part that took a longer period of time to actually improve. Whereas the second patient, the female patient, speech-wise, mentally-wise, she was on point. Just like boom, 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 didn't miss a beat. Physically, though, right leg had atrophied, especially from the knee down. It would get very rigid. It would want to lock out. Even after figuring out that she had, a bit of a leg length and she needed a lift and she was, trying to take pressure off the system, that leg has always been a battle. Her right arm was also symptomatic, but by treating along the nerve tracks and opening up the compressed nerve pathways, we were actually able to get her arm to function better. So she got a lot of use in her arm, but if she goes into a fight or flight state, it will react, whereas the first gentleman, his would not. So that's interesting too, to see with men and women. And I've seen this in a couple cases, not a lot. I'll say maybe 2 or 3 of each, men and women, where women seem to come out better mentally and speech-wise, but physically they take some larger burdens from a stroke, whereas men, mentally, speech-wise, we may suffer more, and physically we seem to excel, or if we do have physical impairments, we seem to maybe not get 100% back, maybe 80, 90%, some cases maybe 50%, but the body seems to rebound better for men. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's because men are very, competition driven, and, to think that we're weak in a moment, that we're super driven on trying to build ourselves back up, all the while keeping our mouth shut. Men aren't big talkers. Everybody kind of understands this. Whereas women tend to be more social. They're very thought process driven. They want to think things out. They want to analyze it. And I think because we both are structured a little bit differently, or we both kind of behave that way. And I know that's not 100% across the board, but as a general kind of use of this, I think that's why women's mentally, they seem to come out a bit more ahead, whereas men physically come out a bit more ahead after strokes. So circling back to this other gentleman who I had been treating, physically he still had no impairments the second to last time I saw him. The last time I saw him, he came in and the first things he started saying was, hey, I used to be able to pivot off my heel. I could turn, I could do this. I've lost this stuff. I go, okay. So immediately I start to think, even though they're testing him for Parkinson's, I'm thinking this is more of a stroke issue. Interestingly enough, there's patterns that develop with strokes from the patients that I've seen, where how we measure cranial pressure, we call them vectors. So it's just a unit of measure. So as cranial bones move, they can compress one bone, or both bones can compress into each other. Now the difference there is if one's just pressing into the other, it's a half vector. If both are pressing into each other, it's a full vector. And what I find with stroke patients is they usually have full vectors, and it will usually manifest on the hemisphere of the brain that's affecting the opposing side. So what this gentleman had, and what the men and women that I've seen in the past have also had, is they end up having vectors on the hemisphere or the side of the brain that was affecting the side. So try to simplify that a little bit. And not all of them, a lot of the individuals I've seen with strokes were right side affected. So this pressure, these vectors were manifesting on the left side of their cranial measurements. So that pressure that was gathering on the left side of the cranium, you could almost see, and there's no scientific way of describing this. This is kind of just my breakdown of how I kind of view it. But when the central nervous system goes into that kind of a shock, it reacts. So we see the same thing happen from like head trauma. So if somebody like hits their head really hard, or maybe in football, they're a wide receiver and just gets sacked, we see certain cranial pressures develop, and the pressure starts putting pressure on different lobes of the brain. Depending on the lobe of the brain, different things can be affected by that. And you could break this down further and say, okay, there's a vector here and there's a vector here. So that's probably affecting this lobe of the brain and this lobe of the brain, and then dissecting further. Okay, those lobes do this. Does patient A or B have symptom or any issues along the lines of, this and this? So when we were going through everything, I said, we're going to treat this like you had a stroke. I'm going to be able to tell very quickly. This is, like I said, no foolproof evidence that we can measure to see if strokes have occurred. This doesn't mean a stroke can be corrected by doing these corrections or anything like that. It's just that I've seen from my experience in my practice that when somebody endures a stroke, we see vectors, a lot of vectors, manifest on either the left side or the right side. The opposing side of the body is usually then the side that's affected, which is the typical stroke pattern. The other thing that happens is as that gets, we'll say, shocked or put into a state of inhibition, as it's overstimulated to the point of inhibition, it overstimulates the rest of the nerve tracts down that affected side. So we'll find entrapment sites in the arms, the forearms, the neck, the shoulder, in the leg, and the thigh, and the calf, where we can actually open those tissues back up again, because the nerves feeding into those areas are also feeding the tissue. So if we can get the neurological feedback in the tissue to calm down, we then open up the impingement sites of these nerves, so the nerves themselves begin to calm down and they aren't as agitated. It would be very similar if you had the ability to go out and grab an electrical line. That line is going to surge and you're going to see electricity coming out of it. Imagine that's your nerve as it's being strangled by a muscle that's in a state of contraction. The tricky part is that muscle is in a state of contraction. So if you stimulate the nerve more, the muscle wants to contract more, until you get to a point of overstimulation where the nerve is now so stimulated that it's inhibiting the tissue. So the tissue actually feels weaker. So the tissue is down-regulating itself. It's becoming weaker, or appears to be weaker, because the neurological burden has become so much that it's shutting the tissue down for the safety, or the what would be almost like it's sacrificing that so that it doesn't continue to put maybe pressure on a joint or on another area, and further cause a problem that could potentially lead to a tear or something like that. Because if a tissue's under contraction that's so great that it's vulnerable, or could potentially injure itself, if your nervous system gives you 100% of what it can get, you're going to rip that muscle. So what I found is your body has this unique system of feedback, whereas if the stimulus is so strong, it will actually dampen or retard the system. It brings the system back down to a state that it can manage, but as it does that, it creates a weakness, and it almost creates a lack of strength. I mean, everything. It turns the muscle off. So the muscle will feel very tender in a state of inhibition. So you know that there's dysfunction there, but it will feel very weak. And usually PTs will go about trying to strengthen these areas, and they can actually exacerbate or make issues worse. And that's why you'll find that some patients feel worse after PT. It's not that they were doing the wrong things. It's that they could have been overstimulating areas that were already stimulated to begin with. And as they stimulate them more, they create more inhibition. So by working through these nerve pathways, we can then open up the tissue to get it to function better. And as it functions better, what we find is the efficiency of the structure and how the patient moves also improves. So this gentleman, just by correcting the vectors that had manifested in his cranium from the stroke, or from, I believe what they call a TIA, like a mini stroke, and then treating the nerve pathways down his right side, helped tremendously. He was able to get some of the pivoting movements back that he was saying that he had lost. His arms began to swing again, doing gait assessments, which I'd also noticed with the other men that I've treated that have had strokes. A lot of times those arms stop to move. Again, this comes back to certain patterns that have locked into place, and also maybe certain nerves that are being entrapped, causing tissues to lock up and kind of hold things in place. So he's also a bit of a case in the process. I have no doubt that he'll probably be feeling better when he comes back. What's going to be interesting is how, or what the long-term effects of having another stroke are going to be on his body, because he held out pretty well the first time. There's no guarantee that that will happen again. So I'm hoping by the work that we do, and by treating these things in the best way we possibly can, we're going to offer him the opportunity to actually recover and try to get back to at least some of what he was doing before. We have the mindset of we want to live, have everyone live pain-free. That's not the reality though for a lot of people, but you have to understand that your reality of pain-free is very different than somebody else's. Somebody else can handle, say 30% of what they're currently dealing with, as long as they can pick up their grandchild. That has more significance to them than you going to the gym and deadlifting 500 pounds. So everybody holds their theory or their idea of what pain-free is differently. Really, pain is essential to life. Pain is there to let you know that something's happening, maybe some change, some growth, but ultimately it's a signal to indicate, hey, something's going through a state of change. And in our kind of work, we look at dysfunction. So when we see pain, we see dysfunction. If we can correct the dysfunction, the pain goes away. And a lot of times the pain will dissipate, like I said, with growth and change. If things are growing and changing, when they plateau, when they stop, the pain stops. That doesn't happen with dysfunction. Dysfunction perpetuates. It adds more to it. It becomes more complex, pulls other factors into it, and begins to affect the structure in its entirety. So, yeah. So that was probably a little bit of a bit of information to wrap your head around. But I wanted to cover those, and they're a little in depth. And like I said, there's no real evidence or scientific studies about what I'm stating here. These are experiences and things that I witness and see by my own hand in my own office. But if anybody has any information they'd love to provide, I'd love to hear it. Especially like I'd mentioned, the metal in the mouth, and whether or not metal just stays in the soft tissue or the lymphatic system. But I will keep you posted as these evolve in the coming weeks. And I wish everybody a Merry Christmas tomorrow. And if I don't get around to another one of these, I wish you a Happy New Year too. So be well, and don't forget to check us out at nstandthings.com.